My dear friends, we join the Christian centuries on this feast of one of the main patrons of this land of saints and scholars, Brigid, whose cross we have actually here. In it we have the wealth of the centuries in one feast. Womanhood, holy womanhood. The woman has a choice whether she will exercise her paternity or whether she will sacrifice it. St Patrick, in his Confessions, talks about the phenomenon of these young noble women coming and wanting to take the veil, sometimes against their parents' wishes. It was a spontaneous movement without coercion, but born from grace and carried on until just about one generation ago in this land. There were always holy sisters. And there was also a goodness there. I remember hearing this from non-Irish people in England, that the typical good Irish nun was a genuine article. And that was before the time of the hard-line feminism which, alas, has contaminated religious life in many places. A woman is not a missed man. She's a complete entity with her own fullness. And that is what needs to be sanctified in all its richness. I remember actually years ago in London doing some voluntary work in a hospice, or at least in a ward of a Catholic hospital where people were dying of cancer. And there was a typical Irish nun there coming and going, and I thought to myself, this is the best of Ireland. Deep blue eyes, just genuine self-sacrifice, nothing for herself, but radiating goodness and gentleness. And even actually in school days I'd come across it, because our parish had several convents. It was a huge parish run by Benedictines, and there were masses all over the place in the early hours. And the parish priest, our prior, said to me, there is a mass closer to you than the parish church itself early, just go there if you want to. And so I did, and it was full of young Irish nuns. Again, that goodness, nothing from that contamination which came in later on, not there, but in general, feminism. With regard to this particular saint that we're feasting, she was a very rich personality, a powerful woman. She worked with St Conleth in radiating the truth and therefore grace, a good example of collaboration between the sexes. And she, by sanctifying her femininity, attracted, which brings me to where I want to land. Grace combined with humanity attracts and is the best magnet. And therefore she became powerful in evangelisation, and the pattern that emerged, not only from her in Kildare, but in general in this land of saints and scholars, was the pattern of grace and culture emerging from centres of radiation, a very monastic church. It works. It still works, actually. If you have a group of people living together under grace, from there comes peace, comes there also this element of diffusion of truth, all that goes with it, hence great centres of education. And when that happens, education is in its correct context. You can't just educate the brain. It's the whole person that is taught. Because after all, one educates to life. And if one only has one part of the brain formed and the person not, that person is a weapon also for damage. With regard to the gospel that we had today, it's a warning about that. This element of not being ready. The wise virgins had their lamps well prepared, and they themselves got up and just lit them when the bridegroom came. The others were distracted and didn't even preempt in any way the arrival. It's a small microcosm of the whole of human misfunctioning in life. I compare two deaths. One time in Rome, listening to the rector of the house that I was living in, who was a missionary, he was often describing stories of the missions, but this day he told us what had just happened in the context of America, because he was American, and he'd had it from a friend, a priest of his, who had to do this very difficult funeral. It was the case of a group of young men who were Catholics but wanted a joyride, and to get the adrenaline flowing, got hold of a car which wasn't theirs and made off at maximum speed along this great new high road which wasn't actually completed. And that's the problem. Somebody could try to see what was coming and couldn't do much about it, and this poor person tried his best to warn them by gestures to be careful later on because the road wasn't quite finished. They just made fun at him. And on they went at high speed, maximum speed, and a few minutes later they were in the beyond forevermore. 4 or 5 young Catholics truncated because they wanted a thrill. The thrill cost them, we don't know, cost them at least their life. I only hope it didn't cost them more. I compare that with what one sometimes comes across, for instance, when letters come to me from one monastery I had a lot to do with in France, because we used to do these retreats from Italy. We were a French community and we were going backwards and forwards to France a lot. And this particular convent was extremely austere. It was the old rite still. Everything was as it was when founded. Probably the strictest monastery actually in the whole of the West. The Victims of the Sacred Heart. Founded way back in the 1800s just to take on board all the penance they could for humanity. Victims. And that's what they were. As much penance as they could possibly think of. Extremely, extremely austere. No heating whatsoever, all the rest of it. And these letters still come to me from them when somebody dies or when somebody makes a profession, because they have vocations. And I sometimes recognize the name. One just came recently. And I often think to myself, these virgins were prepared. All their existence was sacrificial, and as St John Mary Vianney said, il est beau mourir quand on a vécu sur la croix. It is good to die when one has lived on the cross. And so they are just falling calmly into the arms that they have embraced here on earth. At that point, no longer in pain, but in ecstasy forevermore, with the maximum on their copybook. And I compare that with people now who, in the flower of youth, opt to try to rake in as much possible of immediate joy, they think. Give all their energy to satisfaction on every level, and make fun of anyone who dares to think of such a ridiculous old-fashioned thing as a vocation, not realizing actually who's on the winning side and what actually counts. So when we think of St Brigid, we think of all this. I just want to conclude with one little point linked to what I mentioned with regard to the work of grace linked with humanity. The monastic Church of Ireland attracted and was a natural means of evangelization because there was radiation there. People are drawn by beauty and goodness, kindness, and also elevation of worship. And on this point, I just want to mention one thing. Often we have all kinds of campaigns for evangelization, the new evangelization of our time, and we miss what the Lord has actually given us. One of the most powerful means of evangelization is simply to enthrone Jesus Christ and to give him the maximum in beauty and honour and glory by the means that he's given us, by 20 centuries of calmly inspired worship the Holy Spirit has given us our praise after all, and we don't have to improve upon it all the time, as though we're the first to get it right. I'd like to conclude with what Pope Benedict had to say on this. Actually, I think he wrote it before he was Pope, and when he was just Cardinal, he was able to say things more freely with tongue-in-cheek, as he would do, very poignantly. He had to calm down a bit as Pope for obvious reasons, but his early writings are actually all the better for that. He has this to say with regard to creating beauty for God and healing each other. If one is in the interests of wanting everyone to do something all the time, we are, by that fact, obliging everyone to exclude the highest beauty quite often. One specific element he has in mind, it's the obligation that everyone should sing, and by that fact, to include those who can't sing, and to make it impossible for anybody who is specialist in it to have their own thing, a schola or a choir, as though that was anathema. And he has this to say: in more concrete terms, there are a good number of people who can sing better with the heart than with the mouth. But their hearts are really stimulated to sing through the singing of those who have the gift of singing with their mouths. It is as if they themselves actually sing in the others. Their thankful listening is united with the voices of the singers in the one worship of God. Are we to compel people to sing when they cannot, and by doing so silence not only their hearts, but the hearts of others too? This is not to impugn the singing of the whole faithful people, which has its inalienable place in the Church. But it is opposed to a one-sidedness which is founded neither on tradition nor on the nature of the case. And he goes on to criticize what he calls utility music. A church which only makes use of utility music has fallen for what it is, in fact, useless. She too becomes ineffectual, for her mission is a far higher one. As the Old Testament speaks of the temple, the church is to be the place of glory, and as such too the place where mankind's cry of distress is brought to the ear of God. And these monasteries, which from early time dotted Ireland and all the Celtic lands, if you see in Wales the word clan before a name place, it was once a monastery usually. Well, it means that the Holy Spirit had his own means of healing humanity. We're in pain on earth, and we have a right to be healed by the means that God has given for us.